Welcome to the Outer Realm with Michelle DeRoche and Amelia Pisano. Airing live on the United Public Radio Network, 105.3 FM in New Orleans.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Thursday night segment of the Outer Realm. We're broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network, UFO Paranormal Radio Network, 105.3 and 107.7 FM from the beautiful city of New Orleans. I don't know what that was, but I'm going to keep on talking. Anyway, we're fully sponsored by the amazing people over at Folgers Coffee who have been with us since the very beginning. We're so very grateful that they still have the faith to continue on. So thank you, Folgers. We appreciate you so very much. Also, big thank you to Dr. Snick, the sonic surgeon, aka Justin Snicker, the award-winning composer who is the voice and the music behind the intro that you just heard. So check him out. He can be found on places like Bandcamp, Spotify, iTunes, Amazon, you name it. He's there. So thank you very much. Also, big thank you to Steve McGinnis, the artist behind all of our banners and artwork here at the Outer Realm. Check him out on Facebook and Instagram. He just happens to specialize in horror genre. Go figure. Anyway, go check him out. Also, guys, remember, we're going to start very soon. You're going to start seeing a little bit of promo coming up here on the People's Choice Podcast Awards that we have been nominated for year 3. So very humbling and such a privilege that, somebody thought of us out there. So thank you. Tonight, the Outer Realm welcomes back Chris Stiles, who's known for his research of the Shag Harbour UFO occurrence. And this time he's going to be delving a little bit further down the line with that. And he did a lot of in-depth research on the book that he's written called Sweep Clear 5, NATO's UFO Encounter, and it's everything that came in after the fact. So he's also going to be a special guest speaker at the Halifax Symposium this coming October. So for those of you guys who really like to follow Chris and his research and everything he has to talk about, that's where you're going to find him. And I believe it's October 7th. So we're going to be going through a lot of that throughout the evening as well. So I've just sent him off his link. How's it going, Amelia? People chiming in? I can't hear you. Mute. I know, whatever the big bang was.
That's why I went boom. I thought there was another universe being created. But
a portal.
This fan, I moved the wire so the dog wouldn't knock it. And who knocks it first? Me. Because last time he took it down. Right. So he's not aware I'm not in the other room yet.
Right.
How are you?
I'm okay. It's been a little bit of a technological aggravating day, but got it sorted out for a while anyway. But
technology's draining.
Yeah.
Oh, it's draining.
It can be.
Oh, every time I've had to hook up a mic, I've gone through YouTube tutorials like 100 times going, why isn't this working?
Oh, I'm pretty tech savvy, but honestly, I think I just had enough, and I think the mic just had more enough than me. so
I'm good with televisions, but laptops. Yeah. It's almost Friday. That's all.
All right.
It's Friday Eve.
Yes. We got people chiming in. Everybody chiming in.
Hello. Oh, yes. Great USA has a long weekend thanks to your men in service.
I know.
And thank you for your service, all of you who have come and passed and those who are presently fighting.
I know. We had our long weekend last weekend. But
that was Queen Vicky's birthday.
I know.
This is a serious thing.
This is more of an honorable thing.
This is yeah. Queen Vicky's birthday is not a big deal here. It always rains, just letting you know.
I know.
It rains every Queen Victoria Day.
Yes, Tamara, you did miss a day this week. Yesterday, didn't see you in chat.
Yeah. It's because it's a short week. It's throwing
know.
everybody off.
I know. We're
It's
just
throwing
waiting
everybody off.
on
Yeah.
our guest. I did send him a link. I'm not sure if I said that already. So, so
No problem.
yeah. So, but Chris. Oh, and here he is. Okay,
great.
bring him on. Here we go.
Then he can tell us what we're talking about.
I know.
Hi.
Hi,
I
Chris.
love doing that. Hello, Michelle and Amelia.
Hi, Chris. How are
How are
you?
you?
I'm like a teenager, can't you tell?
I love
I
it.
love it.
Yeah.
I love it. We always get excited when you come on.
Young, restless, filled with cosmic angst.
And you're
You know?
I love it. I love it. There
Mm.
we go. Advertising your book,
Oh, yeah.
and of course the symposium. That is fantastic.
Yeah.
So, gosh, I mean, I wish I could go. Schedule just doesn't allow me.
I wish you could too.
I know. It'd be nice to see all
Yeah,
you
we
guys
we
talk.
really when people have come, like yeah, it's usually something kind of special, lobster dinner by the shore or something, and
Yeah.
she doesn't eat seafood, but I'll eat hers.
well, I'll tell you the irony about Shag Harbour. I go down there, everybody tries to give me lobster. Now I have the shellfish allergy. I'll eat anything else that swims. Okay, I
Wow.
love seafood,
Oh
but
no.
yeah, no, it's sad but true.
My nephew's the same way. He's allergic to shellfish.
Yeah.
His sister, who hates anything with fish, can eat it. And
Oh,
he
yeah.
can't, and he loves it. So, like, they just, yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
anything
I
Oh,
else
I'm
is
so sorry.
No.
yeah, anything else that swims is game for me. But just nothing in a shell. And
Especially out there.
this is really odd. When this changed, and the worst thing with me is I know how good it is. It was my favorite food. Get
Right.
this. This is a while ago. It changed at puberty. Something in my
Oh.
body chemistry, and I
So
started
no
getting
more.
anaphylactic shock the minute I can't
Right.
even shuck scallops on the wharf anymore or anything.
Oh, so you can't even think about it, essentially.
No, can't even think about it.
No, it
No.
affects your I have that with kiwi. I'm fatally allergic to kiwi, and I know people think, oh, it's not really out there. It is everywhere.
Yeah,
You just
no,
don't realize it. But
people try to sneak it to you. They think you're being fussy, right? I mean,
well, they're like, oh,
Yeah.
don't have kiwi on the fruit tart. I'm like, but they cut on the same board. Like, it's literally that.
Yep,
I can't
yep.
even, my daughter would eat them, and I would use two
Oh,
plastic bags to grab them at the grocery store.
Yeah.
But my brother didn't get his shellfish allergy until his 40s.
Yep.
It hit
Yeah.
him after, which
And
is really bizarre.
Every exposure, every accidental exposure makes it worse. You become more sensitive. You don't get used to it.
No.
But you got to watch it. Japanese restaurants are bad too. Stuff's flying everywhere as they're chopping, slicing, and dicing.
Yeah, you can't have sushi or anything
Yeah,
like that.
I encountered that mistake already. So
Oh,
No,
do you carry an EpiPen with you?
I'm supposed to.
You sound like me. I really
Chris
should,
just like-
but
This just throws caution to the wind. The guy investigates UFOs. He's like, knee deep with it. So
yeah, you can always carry
what's a bit of
Benadryl.
shellfish? Yeah.
Yeah.
Liquid Benadryl for children in
Yeah.
your car.
Oh yeah,
There
That's
we
all you
go.
need, and you suck back the small bottle, and
you-
you can make it to the hospital.
That's right. You still got to go to the hospital. You still
Yes.
got to
Yeah.
get, and they
Yeah.
give you the good stuff. And you know what that's like? You can jump off the table. You're Superman.
It also
for-
gives you welts, though.
Yes, and then you
Yeah.
want to lay down and go to sleep like 2 minutes later.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You
It's
walk
exi-
around with like these huge pancake-sized welts on your legs when they do that.
Yep. Well, I got that. We're very
Yeah.
similar that way chemically, I guess. Yeah.
Well, they
Wow.
gave me morphine during a surgery, and I had 4NDs after that. And
Wow.
you don't 3 days of the epinephrine, and my legs were covered in big black welts. I couldn't even lean against the
Yeah.
bed. It was so painful.
I guess
So,
social
yeah.
medicine doesn't allow for the benefit of morphine up here. I missed that part, but the rest I'm familiar with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh well. So
Well-
that aside, do aliens have no?
Yeah. So, I guess we should get the show on the road. So, I'm going to assume that this is your research that followed after Shag Harbour. You touched on it just a
Um,
bit at the
Well,
end of the last show.
I've been researching this right since '93, as you'll see. It'll come
well,
out
you made
all
it, yeah,
through.
you brought
It's
it to
been a
our
struggle,
attention.
and I never thought I'd be telling you this story now, whether there'd be a book. I thought this would never be resolved, but I have the definitive answers now. I don't
Oh,
have
wow.
all the answers, but we know now. This happened 7 years before Shag Harbour.
Oh, before Shag Harbour.
Before, this is
Okay.
63 years old, this story.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Okay, I'm going to put this up
And
for everybody to see.
yeah,
Hold on. So we can talk. Okay. There we go.
yeah.
There we go. Let me
I
see
don't
if
even
can
have
put it
copies
here.
yet myself, so
Wow,
yeah.
I'm going to make it a little bit
I
bigger.
want to know
Here
what
we
microphone
go.
you're using. You sound really good, Chris.
Well, it's a $20 thing from
Of course it is.
We're
yeah.
doing it all wrong.
from I don't know if you got that in the U.S. The Source
We're in Canada.
used to be the
Yeah.
Source.
Yeah, we stream out of New Orleans.
Used
yeah.
to be
Yeah.
I got a Blue Yeti mic. I got all kinds of mic, and everybody likes this one the best. It was $20
Yeah.
It sounds so
with the headphones.
good.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
It sounds like a shore. Like it's really well balanced.
Well, I'm familiar with Shore. I used to be
Yeah.
a musician, right? I was a guitar
Right.
player in bands for years, and yeah.
Oh wow.
Very nice.
It's got the same sound quality. It's really good.
Okay.
Okay, Sweet Clear 5, NATO's UFO Encounter. Beautiful book.
Yeah, so this is your upcoming book. Then it's going
It's
to be
out.
released.
It's currently on Amazon.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, it came out about a week ago, but I haven't even received any hard copies yet.
Oh, terrible.
So
All right. Well, where
I'm-
would you like to start with this thing? It looks like, I mean, it's interesting when you read it. It's like, holy
well, you
crud,
could
it's
start. I didn't even let you have the darkest secret yet. When I looked at what I sent you, 15 questions. There's they're going to be
sent the
surprised. There's
picture.
the DEF CON 1 thing, that thing that supposedly in history has never happened, but it has. And
Oh.
that's not a rumor. I have the ship's logs on that.
Just
Yeah.
looking at other pictures here you sent.
But the other thing is my father was on the mission.
Oh.
I had no
Really?
idea. Dad died in 2011,
Oh.
and there's a game he played with me, and we can touch that. Everything's game here, but the big revelation, the how this came to light was like New Year's 2022. It's that recent, and I was like, well, we'll get into it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's do that. Let's start wherever you'd like to start. So, I mean, it seems to me that the whole area is very active to start with.
It is.
Out your neck of the woods.
It has a history.
Yeah, it does for sure.
The tailpipe of North America sticking out into the Atlantic, Nova
It's true.
Scotia.
It's like a little beacon.
That's how the weather uses it. Believe me, here we have a couple sayings here. You probably heard them, but if you don't like the weather, wait 10 minutes. That's common. But here,
Yeah.
what follows 2 days of rain? Monday.
Oh no.
And that's very typically. Although they're promising us beach weather this weekend.
Nice.
Yeah.
Very
I'm
nice.
I'm ready. I'm ready. I'll tell you for that.
Yeah.
No,
So
excellent.
yeah, however you want to jump into this, yeah, fine.
Okay, what made you want to start researching this? Because you've been at
This
it for
well,
yeah.
well, Shag Harbour began in April of 1992,
Yeah.
and with a call to Stanton Friedman. I'm not going to go through all that, right?
Yeah.
But very early on, this Shelburne story, and at that point, it was just a story. And I used to refer to it as the Shelburne USO story, underwater submerged object, right?
Right.
It came from when I first did face-to-face interviews with the divers of the Fleet Diving Unit. And this would have been Good Friday of 1993. Now, that marks me as a fallen Catholic, of course, but yeah. Good Friday, because it was a holiday. I made the arrangement. I was in the home of one of them, and I knew something was coming, because even to set up this face-to-face interview, there was, people kept asking me, like, you knew about Shelburne, right? And I'm like, well, Shag Harbour's in Shelburne County. Is that what you mean? And somebody say, well, you wait till you talk to the commander, or you wait you talk to so-and-so, right? And as the interviews began, was pretty obvious pretty early on that we weren't talking about Shag Harbour when they talked about Shelburne, right?
Right.
The thing is, it was obvious from the start too that this Shelburne story went way beyond. I mean, Shag Harbour's interesting, and very early on, even I used to refer to it as the gift that keeps on giving. And what I mean by that, not so much monetarily, and at times it's been disappointing that way, but in terms of the kind of evidence and how the story is never evaporated or failed. Like every time you discover something new, whether it was a lighthouse log, a ship's log, a new witness, whatever, it always strengthened the case. You know what I mean? And there was never, it was just this. No one's ever explained it or explained it away. And, in the 90s, I was just knee deep in boxes of documents, and every day was a new day, and Shag Harbour was going. But the first face-to-face interviews with the divers was quite something, because their stance on this was, and this is all, by the way, there's a book now, as you know. And in the book, the first half of the book is this quest, because I was looking for this answer of trying to understand the Shelburne story, because they would start to talk, and these guys would very quickly become fearful. And it was striking, because they would say anything or answer any question about the Shag Harbour incident, their mission on that when they were diving, doing the underwater search, for what was supposedly a crashed UFO. It was a headline story here in the paper in Nova Scotia and went out as a wire story around the world. There didn't seem to be any reluctance, any concerns there. But when they kept saying, about Shelburne, and eventually I ran into one of the divers who made it a little more clear, and the reason for that was he was the only one that had been involved and dove on both missions. Shag Harbour happened on October the 4th, 1967, and for about 5 days the Canadian Navy did an underwater search at the request of our Air Force. We had a division that was the equivalent of Blue Book in the U.S., which was the Air Desk in Ottawa, right? It was part of D&D HQ, and they ordered an underwater search. And the reason they did that, and often when I show, PowerPoint performances, I have these endless ugly paper documents, but they all come from official sources. They either come from what is now known as Library and Archives Canada, formerly, National Archives, D&D's Directorate of History, St. Mary's University in Halifax, and places like that. An APRO report for the late Lorenzens that ran what was the second largest grassroots UFO group at the time in the U.S. and Canada. And the document, the paper trails beyond approach, right? But what this diver, the only one that had dove on both missions, when I was in his home on Good Friday of 1993, he told me, look, Shag Harbour's interesting. It was a UFO case. It was real. You've heard all about that. He goes, but, Shelburne was like the real deal. It was the meat and potatoes. He said, when we got to Shag Harbour, we were looking to see if there was anything, but the incident was over. We got there days later, which is true, a matter of record. In Shelburne, they were operating on a Nato mission, a mine-sweeping exercise, actually. And get this, there were 18 ships there, 8 Canadian warships and 10, and they went down. And just serendipitously, they run into aliens on the bottom that are sitting there with 2 craft. Now, over the years and in the beginning, one of the problems is when they first told me this story is they would tell you the bare shell of it, and when you tried to seek out details, very quickly their stamina would erode, and they were having concerns about breaking a specific security else, and they said, man, we can't talk about that. You can talk about Shag Harbour, but this is the real deal. And they would not identify the ships involved. They would not tell you the date, although very early on when you'd meet a contact, you had to get answers quickly because, and first of all, when I say this, 9 out of 10 of the men I would track down, the first thing they would say, and it was just word for word, you would hear, God, we can't talk about that, as soon as you'd ask them. And, when you went home, some of these guys, you would warm them up. You would talk about what I call war stories, things in their career. Because, Navy divers, they do some nasty stuff,
Yeah.
hauling their friends, that didn't make it or the crashed aircraft. And, men that, something went wrong with the regulator and they drowned. It's a tough job.
Mm-hmm.
And, the things they would talk about and the missions they've been on and things they did in, say, the Cuban Missile Crisis, they were very open about. So, right away you realize, wow, well, this whatever this is, it's hot stuff, right? And they'd say, no, you'll have to move on. I can't go there. And you'd ask that, and very quickly these face-to-face meetings would come to an end. Well, I had a witness with me, and, every time you went, and this one that was the most significant interview, when, I was interviewing the diver that had been on both missions. When I got to the door, he tried to pull the plug on the interview. He went to Maritime Command in between. I advised him, of course, not to do that. And when I first got hold of his identity and tracked him down, he was like, yeah, that was a long time ago. I suppose we can talk about that. And he said, listen, I have a business now, a cleaning business. We should get together sometime. And I suggested Good Friday being the holiday. And when the arrangement was made, he'd said on the phone to me, well, he's under the pseudonym Harry in the book. And not everybody in the book has a pseudonym. There are a couple. Some of these men are still alive. They're in their 80s now, but they're a tough lot, I'll tell you, those clearance divers. Anyway, he said, yeah, we can do that. But when I got to the door on that Friday, and I brought a friend with me, and it was a good thing I did, he tried to pull the plug, and he said, I should have called you, but I wanted to do this face-to-face. And he had described himself on the phone as quite a bit of a rebel, so I started in and said, Harry, how does it feel as a rebel that gave 30 years service, to have the government tell you shouldn't do this, and I was kind of pushing his buttons, and the next thing you're going to love this. The door parts, and his new second wife gets behind him and said, I was listening on the phone all week. I made coffee and sandwiches. Invite them in. I've been wanting to hear this story. And he had this dejected look on his face, and she asked again and started pushing him, and he literally stepped aside and let the door open. We came in, right?
Wow.
And I spent the first half hour just kind of greasing the wheel and talking about the kinds of things they do, and he was a little impressed that I had so much knowledge of naval operations, divers, etc. And once coffee and sandwiches were done, I did a bit of a stunt, and I took out the little tape recorder I had. I was hoping to record the interview. This is the 90s, we didn't have smartphones then.
No.
And I stood up, take the back off, and let the AA batteries fall on the floor and say, listen, look, we're just talking off the record, and the wife was helping me so much. She was like, Harry, I want to hear this story. I've been listening all week, And he looked at me, he said, I told you, I never told anybody, And he opened up and talked about it. And he said, well, when we got there, he goes, there was two of these things on the bottom. And once the brass up topside on the ships knew, they weren't long hauling us out of the water. And he said there was still activity going on. These things were alive, and it seemed like one of these craft was trying to give assistance to the other. He said, we shot some film of the event. Before they yanked us to their service, we had a special camera that had old Super 8, but it was waterproof. And, we gave you the name of the guy that shot the film and that. And I was shocked when I said, well, what did you do with the film? He said, we took it to the Defense Research Board in Dartmouth on Grove Street, I said, yeah, I'm familiar. I've been in there, got so far in anyway. So, this was just really something. But as time went on, you could see the regret coming in, and as you started to get those details, and the two things that over the 29 years that I tried to get answers from when I first heard this story till I finally did, that was how all the interviews ended. If they hadn't ended beforehand, or you hadn't just had a door slammed in your face already, they would always end with, we can't go there. Once you asked the name of a ship, once you asked whatever, that was it. So here's the irony, and I'll allow you to interrupt me after this. This is the first real telling of the story, right? Then he talks about these ships. And I said, how many ships? Oh, he said, there must have been a dozen of ours and theirs. And I said, theirs? He said, U.S. ships. It was a NATO mission. And I was like,
What were they doing there?
Yeah.
yeah. I said, in Shelburne. Yeah, he said, we were in Shelburne Harbor, out past the base at the mouth of the harbor, But, and then you'd say, well, what did you see down there? When you started getting details, he'd look down and shake his head and say, you got to move on. And there were some indications. He actually became emotional. And this was really odd when you think of the previous stories he told while we were trying to warm him up to get the actual interview going. And when the interview was over and we left the house, the friend that had come with me, the witness, he's deceased now, Bob McDonald, he looked at me and said, like, something happened down there. I think they lost one of their own or whatever. Oh, I said, something certainly went wrong. But, and we argued, and, that was the first argument. And the first time I realized that I was on a course that for the next, like I say, 29 years, I would disagree with, friends, with other witnesses, authors, co-authors, TV directors, and everybody. They all said, well, this must be the end of the Shag Harbour story because it got away under the
It
area.
sounds
And
like
I'm like,
it is.
well, I
researched that all day.
Yes, yeah. And they said, well, these things don't happen every day, even in Nova Scotia. You don't have UFOs going in every day and that.
I think
and
you
I'm
do.
like, yeah. But Bob, I'll tell you, you'll like it. In the book, there's a part where it says, he looked at me and he said, boy, I sure don't get you. He said, like, you seemed almost like upset when he told you the story. I said, well, I am, because you got to remember in '93, and at that time I hadn't written a book or co-written a book. I hadn't been on television yet or whatever. I was hoping to avoid all this kind of mess like they got into in Roswell, where you had three places say, no, it was here, no, it happened there, and major researchers disagreeing with one another. I thought, well, I got this these little case. It's got all these government documents that are beyond reproach. I don't have to worry about any of that. Suddenly, I get aliens in the water and film and whatever, but they don't want to give me a date, and they don't want to give me. And I know these guys had dove on Shag Harbour, and now they're talking about Shelburne. The one thing, there was a couple things I hung on to. I was kind of an aficionado at how naval operations work and things do. My dad had a naval career, and I thought, there's just no way in the week from when that went on till the next sighting where they seen a UFO leave the water, as a lot of people, if they'd read a book would know or seen some of the documentary treatments I did. A week later, on October the 11th, 1967, 1 week later to the hour, 2 sets of lights come out of Shag Harbour and fly away out into the Gulf of Maine. And these men during the interview kept saying, well, we sat over this thing for a week. So, my friend Bob McDonald and many others said, well, that must be it. They sat over this thing a week. The Navy was down there. Look, the Navy, it would take them a week to do the paperwork before the ships, unless we were in a state of war. It doesn't work like that.
No.
So I always had a big problem with that, just from the logistical end. The other problem I had was like, geez, aliens in the water, I mean, people say, well, look, you're the UFO guy. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, there was an even better story later on. They were in the water supply in Halifax, according to these guys. Oh, the stories, But anyway, they didn't want to answer the date, but very early on, before this guy managed to scare himself, or, I'm probably guilty as charged. I contributed to that, no doubt, with the questions. But before that happened, when I said, was this 1967? Was this? And he was like, no, I think it was farther back around the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, that would be October 62 as opposed to October 67. And that always stuck with me, because I find when you do these things, often the first off-the-cuff answer when things are uncertain is the best one. Before you start trying to move things around and make sense of it and connect the dots, right? And that had always stuck with me, The other thing is, over the years, as Shag Harbour became well known, and as we learned more and more about that case, and it always came together, when people would hear the Shelburne story, they would have their theories, but people, whether it was like Don Ledger or Graham Sims that I'd done books with, or a TV director, people like Mike McDonald and that, they weren't in the room. They didn't hear the voices. They didn't get these interviews. They didn't see the emotion, right?
Right.
And it was hard, and they all struggled to understand me, and I get it. And looking back on it, it seems funny. Some of the attitudes, like me worried about Shag Harbour, it seems almost juvenile now, But at the time, I was like, oh, man, I don't want to go down that garden path like they got that mess in Roswell,
Yes.
Not that I'm discounting Roswell, not that, but I mean, oh, my God, the mess.
It was really convoluted, wasn't it?
I've seen fistfights, at conferences
Yeah.
about it amongst researchers.
You're kidding.
People call, I wish I were.
Oh, that's ridiculous.
I wish I were. And I didn't want any of that. And to be honest, we've never had that. But, we had a lot of good, I can remember that first night in the car, and I think this line's in the book, where we're going back, and Bob asked me, because you're really something, he said, because he says, this is the meat and potatoes and the gravy to this case of Shag Harbour. I said, you don't know that. No, I'm not buying it. And he was saying, you almost acted pissed off about this or something. And I'm like, Bob, lighten up. As far as I'm concerned, he says, you combine the two, this is all that and a bag of chips. I remember him saying. I thought, how scientific is that? Wow. Let's take that one to court. And he says, don't you realize this field, it's a lot like folklore? I said, it won't be when I'm done with this case. And we had this very different stance. Now, we were quite friendly, but that was a friendly argument, right? And this went on for years. Unfortunately, Bob, he suffered from a severe lung condition, didn't live to see the resolution here, But anyway, all along, that first half of the book, like I've said, that's out about this, is about the quest over the years. How many false leads came forward? How many people tried to explain it to me? And a lot of these things that came up, they look so good, Michelle. They were like, you'd find some document and you could interpret it so that these cases were connected. In fact, it would have made more sense. It was quite seductive, it was so easy. But I always resisted it. Usually the others got excited. I'll admit, look, there was days when I thought, yeah, that could be. But then when you went through it, I'm like Stanton Friedman used to call me the bulldog, Right. And when I'd get on the trail of it and I'd find out, when you re-interviewed the people, when you found the errors or when you found what happened, nothing was ever definitive, and it was frustrating. Even by 96, which is 3 years after first hearing the story, that was the first time I spoke in the U.S. at one of the national MUFON conferences, and I did a paper. They used to publish them in the Symposium proceedings, and that topic that year was Shag Harbour in Perspective. And in that, I tell the Shelburne story for the first time, sort of in a public way, other than maybe, a fire hall in Shag Harbour or something.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end, I say, look, at the moment, this is a story, a very interesting one. And it may not always remain a story, but it remained a story until almost New Year's Day 2022. And at the time, I really grew to despise it. And every time one of these red herring solutions come up that would join or explain the Shelburne case or, give you some evidence. And my thing always was I wanted the proof in the sense, of course, Bob used to say, you know what, you're a brat, he'd say. Shag Harbour has spoiled you. Nobody else gets all this paperwork and nobody wants to argue. And I remember him coming down and watching me speak, for example, in Greensboro that first time in the U.S., and Phil Class coming up and shaking my hand and says, wow, amazing job you did. And that made me mad too.
Right.
The skeptics were saying, no, there's something to that one, and you done good. But it was very frustrating. And I used to say, Shag Harbour may be the case, the gift that keeps on giving. I said, but Shelburne's the fly in the ointment, is the way I used to describe it. If you had somebody sticks a mic in your face and you're doing a 30-second interview, that's the way I used to put it, and that's how I felt. It was a love-hate thing, and eventually I was disgusted by the case. When you look how many... No, that's not too strong a word. If you knew how many ship's logs they'd gone through, thousands of pages of paper looking for that evidence, because somebody would call a story, say, I think that HMCS Chaudière was on.
Can I
that
put the
mission.
picture up you sent me of the ship's log?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Can I do that? Well, no, keep talking. I'll put it up.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not
Yeah.
sure what you're showing. Oh, you mean just the
sent a
cover
picture.
of the
It
book?
said ship's log.
Oh,
So- yeah.
I could have said, that one of 8. Well, first of all, remember, I didn't know what ships to ask for. So,
Okay.
and
I just-
sometimes
All right.
the way the rumors would come to me were
There we
very, that is actually the ship's log of the command ship of the mission.
Okay.
And as I discovered in 2022, this was indeed, as the divers described, but they never filled in the blanks for me, this was a NATO mission. It was a mine-sweeping exercise. It involved, like I say, 8 Canadian ships and 10 U.S. warships, plus a large diving platform that was a supplementary vessel for the Canadian Navy. Because when they were in Canadian territorial waters, we were in command of the mission. And this is the ship's log from the command ship, which was HMCS Cape Scott,
Wow.
which turns out to be my father's boat when he was in the Navy at the time.
Wow.
He was one of the medics on it.
Really?
Cape Scott
Really?
was like a supply ship, and it was a special NATO command ship that was set up for that, because we did so many those kinds of missions with NATO back in the 60s. Remember, we still had a 60-ship Navy then. It's not like
Right.
today. And Cape Scott filled that role. She was a supply ship. She was like 450 feet in length. She had an 8-bed hospital and a full decompression chamber for divers, which is why she was there.
Wow.
But she was also the command ship of the mission over us and the U.S. vessels there, right, in
Right.
Shelburne Harbor. Now, I would have solved this years ago had somebody said, well, it was a mine-sweeping mission. I remember the only thing I ever got was out of the very first diver when he said to me, when I said, well, why are you guys there? Why were there divers down? And he said the British had shown us some new kind of recording mine, for practice. And he said they were, proximity mines. So those are mines you don't actually have to touch for them to explode. They
Right.
program so a ship gets so close, boom, vibration, or they could program them in other ways. And he never said we're on a mine-sweeping mission, or we had. And to tell you how much this was specialized for that, the Canadian vessels, the 2 big ships we had there were the Cape Scott, which was a large vessel, and the Blue Throat, which was what they used to call a loop layer. And the other 6 ships we contributed were all minesweepers. On the American side, you had a large vessel called the USS Orleans Parish, and the USS Yazoo, and then the rest were all minesweepers. But if they told me that at the time we didn't know what kind of ships, and we primarily focused on destroyer escorts. And
Right.
oh my God, if you'd seen the amount of boxes and logbooks I've gone through, thousands and thousands of pages, because somebody would give us a clue saying, I think Terra Nova was involved, and then tell us why, and it usually made good sense. So I'd target what I thought the date was, and then you go a month ahead and a month behind and a month ahead and a month behind, and you went over the years at 40 cents a page from National Archives. It starts to add up, right?
Right. It does.
And I never found anything. In fact, get this, out of those thousands of pages, never once did we even put a Canadian Navy ship in Shelburne Harbor. Not once. I mean, so I thought, but I kept to this belief, and, I can remember, again, some of my co-authors and fellow researchers mocking me for this, saying, he's stubborn and he's dedicated, if nothing else, and but I was like, no, I said, when I see the evidence, I'll know it right off, And I thought, if nothing else, this will prove that, if I see one ship in Shelburne Harbor, I'll request this log. It'll probably mention the others. This will open like a blossom, I said, if I ever get there. But, anyway, But at the time, it wasn't a priority. In fact, when I first heard the story, for about the first 6 months, I did nothing. And they kept saying, "What are you going to do? This isn't like you." And I said, "Well, it's a story. It's interesting, but I got this little thing I'm working on called Shag Harbour, and Shag Harbour was giving up new stuff all the time. I was
This
like a
little
kid.
thing.
Yeah, I was like a kid in a toy box, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and it was 3 years later before I started making these kind of grandiose statements like the Shag Harbour Incident, the world's only UFO crash, supported in that interpretation by government documents that are freely available and entirely without controversy.
Well, it's famous.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
a
it is.
famous,
I
it's,
mean,
you
when
know,
you got to remember, when I started looking
Yeah.
into it, Stanton Friedman never heard of it.
right.
That must have
Right.
felt good.
3 years later, well, it did, because 3 years
Yeah.
later, I was listening to, again, one of his rivals, Kevin Randall, and he was on, I don't know, Art Bell or some show, and he picked the top 10 cases, and number 3 was Shag Harbour. Like, it had that kind of an impact 3 years on.
Right.
And in fact, when we first spoke in the same place, he said, "You're coming up to my room afterwards. I'm writing a book called UFOs in the 90s. He goes, "You're the first chapter." And that happened to, the Randall Report, it was called UFO. Things were just open. It was a very exciting time, Yeah, so Shelburne, it was a crazy story. But, I mean, this is a field filled with crazy
But
stories.
they're very similar from what you described after Shag Harbour.
Sure.
What happened after that, and these crafts were underwater, and you saw this thing take off. Military came in, both sides of the border.
Yeah.
Are they connected?
No.
Come
No.
on.
No, they're not connected.
Really?
No,
No.
that doesn't just happen.
No. Well,
Twice.
no. Yeah. No, it's
Yeah.
happened.
It's
It's happened. It's happened more than twice, in fact. Right? No, and that was
Right.
You're right, though, Michelle. Look,
Yeah.
I
That's
don't
luck.
mock your logic.
Yeah.
This is what everybody thought, and they were right to think it. I wasn't thinking they were feeble-minded or
Right.
not what it took to be a UFO investigator, whatever that means.
I would have been a terrible investigator because I would have thought for sure they were connected. I did.
Listen, there were days. Look, there were many days I'd talk
Yeah.
for 3 or 4 days and thought, well, they might be right. How many times I did shows and documentaries where the director would insist, well, we're going to include that story, and I'm going to say, I can't say they're not connected. I don't feel they're connected, and that would get edited out. You know what I
Right.
mean? But I was always the naysayer about that. If somebody said, well, do you know it isn't? No, I can't say that. You know what I mean? But you know what? If it's out there, I'll find the answer someday. And, as the years became decades, I was pretty doubtful, right? But I stuck
Right.
by it. In fact, get this, eventually it reaches the point in the book. The first half of the book is about the quest. I reached the point where I'm done with it. And I say that officially. I was actually writing a book under contract with a publisher. And that book is yet to come out because the first chapter, the longest in the book, is about Shelburne and why I've given up on it and why I hate it so much. And then guess what happens?
There we
It
are.
floats to the top, right? But I say, listen, I still believe the men. I believed I was the only one alive that still heard the testimony. I think I gotten pretty good over the years at finding the cases that have depths and, hold up to close scrutiny, that don't evaporate. And, I believe that. But, until somebody sends me the break, that evidence, right? I'm not lifting a finger. I am done with this case. It's burnt me out, and that was how the chapter ended. And then the next thing you know, hold the presses on the book, right? And it all started to unfold, and in the strangest of ways, because really I'd come to accept I wasn't going to get the answer. It was just one of those things. And if people said to me, if I'd been on a show or we were doing a recap, you ever getting anywhere with that Shelburne thing? I would have moaned and I would have said, well, I have to live with it, But, I console myself with this little thing called Shag Harbour and a handful of other cases, right? And recently I was on another podcast and somebody said, so we don't have to ask you which one is your favorite case. I said, yeah, you do, because it isn't either one.
Really?
I've ran into cases that are much more interesting than either of those. They may not be significant. They were to me, and what's the reason for that? Is they gave me some genuine insight into how the phenomena works. That's the difference. What's the strength of Shag Harbour? It's a very compelling argument for UFO reality. Really, even the, all the skeptics and the groups, they can't attack it. And when they're there in the audience and I would present, like, they don't even try. You know what I mean? That's the strength of that case.
Is that,
right?
would you consider that to be like the Canadian Roswell?
Well,
with respects to sightings or the big, the big one.
It's Ros, yeah, but
the one that people will remember. I guess
it in people's minds it's inevitably compared with Roswell, but the way I put it is it's Roswell without the baggage.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
There's no controversy as to the documents that we have on the case. There's no doubt that it happened and that the case remains open and unsolved. And it actually gave us a real insight, the other major thing it did, into what the Canadian government thought at the time, which was that this was E.T. They didn't have that evidence there, but when they looked at the fact there was no missing later aircraft, when they looked at the amount and the quality of the witnesses, including the RCMP officers.
So it wasn't a back engineered something that went down, like there were extraterrestrials here.
No, and here's the thing too, is that nobody even reported a UFO that night. People called simply claiming they saw a plane crash or that lights had gone in the water. And they rushed to the shore. They were worried about survivors, right? 7 people called instantly, the RCMP detachment in Barrington Passage, which is nearby. No one reported a UFO. It was the authorities that referred to it, as they saw there was no missing, because there were no missing or late aircraft. When they took a second look and looked at the testimony, including of the RCMP officers who saw the thing on the water, one of them saw it in the air and on the water, Ron Pond, who had been out on highway patrol. The thing was, right away. I mean, one of the documents I show was a military telex that went between the bases, right? And it's signed by Squadron Leader William Bain. He was the fellow in charge of the air desk there in Ottawa, right? He's quoted on the Chronicle Herald under the headline story, "Could be something concrete in Shag Harbour UFO RCAF." And at the top of that document, I've looked at just hundreds and hundreds of these things. In big letters, he writes UFO and underlines it 3 times and puts his name there, signs it at the bottom. And when I interviewed him face-to-face in Ottawa in 1994, he told me he was convinced it was the real deal, and they treated it as such. There was no conventional explanation. And in fact, he issued a memorandum that was signed by everybody in the Defense Department that was somebody. And when you read that in the 3rd section, it says quite clearly, a preliminary investigation has been conducted by the Rescue Coordination Center, and it has been determined that this UFO sighting was not caused by a flare, float, aircraft, or in fact any known object. Well, that's a pretty short list of what it leaves, right? Yeah. So that's the strength of Shag Harbour. It's a compelling argument for UFO reality, and
it's more interesting what happened after the fact.
Yes. So then, where does that leave Shelburne? Because which
is pretty much exactly the same thing that happened after Shag Harbour.
In none of these documents do we see any talk to UFOs on the bottom. That story had been there. People had tried to attach that story. I think when I first got these divers to talk to me, that they were like glad to let the story be mistakenly attached so they could hide behind, so it could masquerade it, so that, as long as they thought it was that, then we would never find the real story. Let it hide behind the other UFO crash we couldn't hide, right?
Right.
And as long as I kept looking for something that happened 7 years later for a type of ship that was never involved, we were never going to find the answer, right? And you may say, well, how did you make such a mistake, like always look for destroyer escorts, and in the end there was none of those on the mission? At the time, in NATO, Canada's main mission was anti-submarine warfare. you don't conduct that without destroyer escorts, right? So the assumption was anything we were involved in, there would always be a destroyer escort. I knew where the Bonnie was, our aircraft carrier at the time. It wasn't there. In fact, I actually interviewed William Landymore, the admiral, the guy who tangled so much with our former defense minister.
Right.
About unification and all that, And he'd heard the story. He said, no, we were up in Montreal getting a refit. We kept the crew on. He says, I remember Shag Harbour when it happened. But then he told me, too. He says, you heard about Shelburne. You know about Shelburne, right? Well, I said, could you please tell me a date of the name of the ship? And he just laughed. He goes, oh, Chris, we can't go there, man. We cannot go there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, yeah, I mean, I was interested. I kept looking. I'm that kind of guy. I can't leave it alone. But at the same time, it wasn't going anywhere. And, these documentaries that come up. Well, the final straw for me, I did a documentary with the Cousteaus there, the grandchildren there, Celine and Fabian Cousteau.
Yeah.
And they were very interesting, and we did this thing in earnest, and it was scripted. And I thought, well, you never know. It's probably about as lucky as buying a lotto ticket. But while we're down there and doing underwater search to make part of this, essentially diving show for it on a mystery, But then when we got there, I was very disappointed to find the boat we had wasn't well equipped, didn't have a proper anchor. We couldn't set up operation where we're supposed to. The dive master declared it. For an anchor, they had a bucket with 300 pounds of hard cement in it, and the boat was drifting in the wind. Dive master said it ain't safe. So in the end, we were doing what I call making television, but it was not contributing to the case. And when that show was done, I swore I would never do it again. And I said no to some work and some paying gigs. I'm like, no. Until Shelburne is solved, I'm done. Connecting it to Shag Harbour. And, some other people that have been involved with the case and it helped were kind of disappointed because, we'd lost some work and, But I'm saying, no, I ain't doing it anymore. I'm not buying it. I'm not believing it. It's time to take a stance. And it looked like it was going nowhere. But, we kept getting documents that would come up and people would come. I was even pulled over one day by a policeman. And I started digging up my license, insurance, and registration. He said, no, I just got a tip for you on Shag Harbour and Shelburne. You can put that away. It's that crazy. Like they were coming all the time. You got to remember in Halifax, too, you got 9,000 people that worked in the dockyards and for the Navy, And people would get off buses sometimes or miss their ride, run over to me. You're the UFO guy. Have they ever told you about what happened on Terra Nova in 62 or, Chaudière or whatever? And you would try to chase these things down. But to no avail, it wasn't coming together. And I don't know if you want to direct me another way, but do you want to jump together to when it all started to open up and blossom?
I'm just letting you go because I know that you have the whole story laid out. So I'm just patiently sitting here.
I don't mind interruption or clarification. I welcome it.
We're learning along with everyone else.
Yeah.
So we're going to let you keep going. And
well, like I say, we can't go into the depth that that I have in the book because there's a lot to unpack.
Oh, for sure. You don't want to give away the whole book. You want people to buy it. So
I do.
Sure.
It's what's going to finance the further research. Believe me, because I'm not done with it yet. I thought I was done with it. I actually say that in the book, and once I say that's it, I'm done with Shelburne. I can't, unless somebody hands me the answer. But then I believe I said something to the effect of, but Shelburne wasn't quite done with me, and it was about to rub my nose in it in a way it had never done before. It was even willing to give up some of its secrets, right?
Right.
So
right.
I'm in my little house here in Eastern Passage, about 40 feet from the ocean. I'm
already jealous. You have to keep going.
I was going to say, I love that.
Well, I don't have water frontage. I have to cross the street and look both ways before I get to the ocean.
You're breaking my heart. I feel so bad for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I have the pollution of Lake Ontario, but thank you.
I remember going up with my father and swimming in Lake Ontario and
you swam in Lake Ontario and you're still not green?
You're not glowing in the dark. So, yeah.
That's a good thing.
I remember I first went in, not even being past my knees, and I looked at him and said, "What is the point of this?" Because I closed my eyes, said, "I can't tell where the water ends and the air begins, and I could smell Cleveland or something from across the lake." And I'm like,
Yeah,
"What is
that
the
wasn't
point
the
of
place
this?"
to try lake water.
It was a bit better in Lake Erie. He had a place down in Port Stanley, anyway.
Yeah,
Right.
it's cleaner.
Yeah, yeah, that was okay. That was okay. Anyway, yeah, we're gonna jump ahead. There's
Yeah.
so many stories I could tell in between, so many frustrations, and a lot of mystery solved along the way too. There was a lot of things that didn't make sense, but you'd resolve, right? It's just like Shag Harbour. A number of IFOs came out of that case, right?
Well, years later.
That were connected. Yeah. So it was all contributing in some way, but I wasn't getting what I wanted. I was frustrated. So anyway, okay, Christmas 2021 in coming toward New Year's 2022. Not that long ago, right? I don't know any more than I did in 1993 about what really went on. Although there's a couple things I'll get back to later on that were surprising. What kept me going, because I was done. Anyway, at this point, Shelburne's the furthest thing from my mind. I'm thinking, I wonder if that book's coming out soon. There were so much more interesting things in that book other than the chapter about why I'm done with Shelburne, but that was there. It was the last thing. Christmas was over. The smell of turkey and mincemeat and all that was dissipating from the house. The girlfriend gone to visit relatives. I'm alone. I'm going to indulge in a night of watching a bunch of stuff recorded on the PVR, UFO docs. Most of it turned out to be, a sort of second round treatments about the Tic Tac sightings and some other things, and I'm just catch up. I'm watching there. It becomes a marathon session, and I don't know, it's 3 or 4 a.m. I'm finally done. I decide to go to bed. So I go to bed, and I have this dream. Don't get too excited. This dream is not... It's not like Paul McCartney.
I was thinking I was walking through chocolate when you said don't get excited. I'm like, my mind goes to chocolate.
This is not even the cake dream. But let me put it this way. No, what I mean by don't get too excited is this is not as clear as like, Paul McCartney dreaming up the melody to Yesterday or something.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Or Hey Jude.
But I had this dream and like it was really weird, and it was like it was just a reenactment of when I was 5 years old. And I'm in the kitchen at a house here in Dartmouth, and I'm listening, as I like to do. I try to hide there stealthily and listen to adult conversation. Right? And in this case, it's one of my father's friends and him from the Navy. And they're sitting at the table. It was so vivid, the dream. They're trying to play crib. Here's what I remember. Here's what I mean by detail. They can't find the crib pegs. So they do that old sailor's trick. They take out a couple wooden matches and light them. Two of them, you snuff them out, so you get 2 burnt ones and 2 unburnt ones. So you can tell, and you put them in the crib board, right?
And it's like checkers when you're missing one.
Yeah, they're drinking gin and talking. And I hear them tell this story about Shelburne. And the diver says to my father, he says, "Hey, Hal, look what happened to us." He goes, down at Shelburne, there was no doubt what we're dealing with down there. I mean, it was goddamn aliens. And I'm sitting around at the table, and it's sort of like a lucid dream, and I can remember thinking, I think this is a dream.
Right.
But, the conversation goes on, and he's saying, yeah, and he said, look at the trouble I got into with the Americans. But it's all very, very detailed. And next thing you know, this goes on, and eventually I'm noticed under the table. I'm taken to the living room to watch television with Mother.
Right.
And I wake up, and I'm like, what the hell was that? I go, that was dumb.
That was a little
And
push.
I'm the only thing that's impressing me is like the detail. You could see and feel the texture. It was like And I remember thinking for a minute, can I trust? No, don't go there. You know, memory's so plastic. You've seen it in witnesses, right? I'm thinking that was interesting. But remember I told you I have this real thing about naval history and function in the ships, right? And I thought, God, that was Dad's ship back then. What was that thing classed as? Because it was a supply ship, but it was more than that. It had an 8-bed hospital. Had
Right.
you know, and I thought, so I just grabbed my laptop that I'm sitting in front of right now with you and open up Wikipedia and put in HMCS Cape Scott, which was Dad's posting at the time on the ship. He was a medic. And it comes up, and I read about the ship's service history, and there's one sentence at the end that hadn't been there before when I'd read this years before. And it says, in 1960, HMCS Cape Scott was involved in the mission Sweep Clear 5 off Shelburne, Nova Scotia. That's all it says. No other detail. But remember, after you've gone through like 10,000 ship log pages and realized none of those ships were ever in Shelburne, well, I'm just like, and after the dream, you know what I mean? I'm like, I jumped up and I can remember saying aloud, no, 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 no. And inside I'm going, yes, it's got
Yeah.
this has to be it. But that's all the information it
So
gave.
you have a name for this mission now, essentially.
And I have a name of the command ship, but just
Yeah.
the one, HMCS Cape Scott.
Right.
So I look up HMC, you know, I try putting in at that time Sweep Clear 5 and just NATO mission, minesweeping exercise. No more than that, not listing anything else.
Well, 18 ships
So,
is pretty substantial. You'd think
you
there'd
know,
be a lot more info.
I'm wandering around making a copy and trying to think, well, where do I go from here? Like, whoa, 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 whoa. And of course, this is in time still of COVID, right? So I know any request I put into Library and Archives Canada is going to take forever. You know what I mean? And I need answers now. I got one hint of an answer, but is it the answer? You know, and it's like, oh my God, I tormented myself. I'm just.
But it
So-
all falls into, I mean, cover up. I mean, it's sign of the times back then, right?
And I think, well, if we had that many ships and we were down there, somebody's going to brag about this. And I thought, we used to have a magazine then called The Crow's Nest, the Canadian Navy magazine. So the next day I go to some secondhand bookstores that weren't supposed to be opened, and I got in and I start going through all this old crap, you know. And I find some copies of The Crow's Nest. Now, I figure in those days, you know, before digital, it's going to take a few months before any coverage would get in the magazine. Now, I'm already saying don't get too excited, because I'd gone through these magazines before. I did more than just order ship's logs from, you know, Ottawa and follow the odd hot tip that never panned out. So
Right.
I get these Crow's Nests and I go home, and I have one that was from December 1960. And I look at it, and I look at the table of contents, and it doesn't list anything that would appear to possibly mention this at all. So I decide I better just read the whole thing. And I start getting through. And somewhere in the third column of some story that was unrelated, something about the Columbia being in Uganda, it just starts referring to, there's no title to it or anything, talking about Sweep Clear 5, this mission. It was almost like an afterthought. It was in there.
Wow.
And I read about it, but in these words, it names all 18 ships and explains the mission and what it was. There's no talk of aliens yet or anything, but it was a NATO minesweeping mission. Dad's boat was in command, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, okay, well, I got to start looking for ship's logs now. But now I got a list of ships, right? So while I'm filling out online, I go, you know, and start requesting these logs for the time frame for the month of October 1960. And I can't believe how far back the date. I think, my God, because some of the ships that were involved, get this, because eventually one of the last things I did in the last few years is I went beyond destroyer escorts and I started looking at other classifications of vessels. And I had requested these logs, and in some cases I stopped in 61. Or when I hit 1960, I just missed it, you know?
Right.
Yeah. because I thought, well, he said around the Cuban Missile Crisis. My God, 1960. How long? My God, these guys. What were they, 12 in the Navy? You know what I mean? Like, in 1960.
Yeah.
So it just didn't make sense. But now that I've got this date, how this plays out, describes how long the mission was, how it grouped, whatever. So anyway, I start sending in requests. In the meantime, I go online, back to Wikipedia and other wikis and other more scholarly references, and I start looking up the service history of the ships. Now I got the names of all the ships. Now I have the date. And I start finding these weird discrepancies. Because in the magazine, when you read this, it just tells the story of what they did and how long they're in the harbor, what they were trying to accomplish. They had an 8-mile dog-legged course where they laid mines, and they're trying to dodge them and not blow anything up and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, but it kind of ends with that sort of, and a good time was had by all. We love working with our American friends. Okay, that was the Canadian version. When I start reading the version on U.S. ships, especially USS Yazoo, it doesn't read like this at all. Well, first thing I find is that on October the 15th, which would be a Saturday, that while trying to get through this dogleg passage, that the Cape Scott Dad's boat suffers complete engine failure and is going to run aground on the shores of Shelburne Harbor. And they'd gotten an order from Halifax to get everything out of the harbor, get these Navy ships out to sea now. And even though the Cape Scott lost power, they tell her, do not drop anchor, get out of the harbor. They're unable to start the engine. USS Yazoo comes back and rescues her and tows her out of the harbor to safety. None of this in the Canadian version of the story. And the more I looked into some of the American renditions, not their actual logbooks at this point, but just the service histories, this mission doesn't sound like any fun at all, and quite different than the Canadian. So I thought that's interesting. So I put in these requests for logs, and like I say, this is the time of COVID still in Ottawa. And I get a warning saying, these things that normally happen in 30 to 45 days, which is an obligation under the Act, could take longer. It took me 7 months to get the log. I just sent an inquiry once. And here's the other thing. I asked for several vessels, and like the Blue Throat, I'm sorry, those logs are destroyed. I'm sorry, this one was a mistake in the retention schedule. This is... And I thought, oh my God, if I don't get Cape Scott,
Yeah.
But 7 months later to the day, I get the Cape Scott log released, which was great because it was the command vessel, right? So the first thing I do when I get it is I turn to October the 15th to see, and of course, sure enough, unlike that they failed to report in the Canadian records and magazines and that, when I'm looking at the ship's log, yeah, she's in real trouble. She's ordered out of the harbor, cannot comply with order to leave harbor, weigh anchor anyway. Well, she's going to run aground. Like, say, our American friends rescue us, right? Very odd. This is after it sits for 3 or 4 days. So then I go back, and because she was the command ship, this log is just filled with orders, like for the other ships and running, the mission, right? And all kinds of naval jargon and like all the stuff you get from National Archives, extremely poor copy, in the electronic transcriptions, right? And you're wading through all these little pencil entries, and I'm trying to remember, and I'm learning some of the Navy jargon that had fallen into disfavor and I was uncertain of, but I'm going through this. So eventually I get frustrated, get this, and I go back to my old military file cabinet behind me here, and I go pawing through that, and I get out my notes. Remember, I wasn't allowed to record in those interviews in the home. I get out the notes. I would run outside when the interview was over and write furiously and just run the car. I remember Bob wanting to go home and say, I got to write all this down, what they said. And when I read this, I said, well, when did this happen in the mission? And the diver said, well, it happened, just when we started, really. We come down from Halifax. The Americans laid the dummy minefield. We come down there, and took some time to get the ships organized, and just as soon as we enter it, we're only about an hour into the mission, which was supposed to take a week, and all hell breaks loose, right? So I thought, well, he goes like, man, they panicked. And when I hear that, I thought, well, let's look for some panic, right? So I go back. All the ships arrived in Shag Harbour at the outer, just outside of it, getting organized, about 6 a.m. on the October the 12th, 1960. And when they're all in position, which takes till about noon, and everything's lined up, and they think they know what they're all doing, coordinate, and they start moving in. And I get to about 60 minutes, and it's just business as usual. They see the odd mine, 4-ship annex, all this naval jargon about doing the normal, boring naval stuff.
Yeah, the exercises.
12:42, just after noon, suddenly, it's like everybody has to stop and in position, and I read the letters, and at first it didn't even hit me what I was looking at. It says, assume DEFCON 1.
Now, for those who are just listening, can you describe that?
Yes, the DEFCON system is 5 levels. It's still in use. We had just signed on to the system with the Americans 1 year before, in October 1959.
Right.
You often see it portrayed in the movies, usually backwards in error.
Yes.
But the way it works, like, in peacetime and when the threat level is low and we're not anticipating sudden war or thermonuclear disaster, we would be at DEFCON 5. Through difficult times, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, to give an example, and I give examples in the book, the United States went to DEFCON 3 in the military, except for SAC, Strategic Air Command, went to 2. And by the way, Kennedy came up here, John Kennedy, and went to see our Prime Minister then, John Diefenbaker, to request that we go to DEFCON 3 with them, and he wanted the Canadian Navy, the Atlantic Fleet, to sail out and guard the North Atlantic for Russian subs coming down so that they could have an even larger, more secure blockade of Cuba. This is during, and Diefenbaker refused. There's this whole story is legend, especially in this area. You hear the older guys talk about it. But because they had a bad argument, Kennedy left a note that let Diefenbaker know what he thought of him for this, I guess, on the desk. And, he ordered the defense minister of the time, this is before Paul Hellyer, by the way, that we weren't to get involved. Nothing is to move. We're not going to help the Americans, And one of the admirals who was in charge of the Atlantic Fleet at the time, Rear Admiral Kenneth Dyer, who was in charge during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and by the way, was in charge of this mission in Shelburne, and had designed it, took American orders and sent all our ships to sea against the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister. It's quite a thing.
Wow.
There have been books written about it. He was quite hawkish. He was a NATO commander at the time, and he saw his role greater than just being a Canadian. He risked his career, and he did that. Eventually, the Prime Minister had to follow suit because other NATO nations would join in and support the Americans, and public pressure went the other way. Anyway, this guy was the in charge of the Clear Sweep 5 mission there, Ken Dyer. Unfortunately, I never got to interview him. I got to interview other admirals in the Navy. Of course, it was only in 2022 I realized this was his baby.
Right.
But anyway, we're back to 1960, October the 12th, DEFCON 1. What does that mean? Well, like I say, I gave the example. Cuban Missile Crisis, which is the closest we came to nuclear war. U.S. Armed Forces go to 3, except SAC, which goes to 2. If you look up on Wikipedia or even something more scholarly or ask a military historian, you say, have we ever gone to DEFCON 1? And there's several articles about that, for example, on Wikipedia. The answer is no. But I get this book of this mission that no one wants to talk about, that everybody hides and misrepresents.
Right.
And I get to that date, and what do I see? Assume DEFCON 1.
Wow.
These 18
Wow.
ships. Assume DEFCON 1. It said it quite clearly. But here's where it gets even weirder. 3 minutes later, they drop that to 3. They lower lifeboats into the water. Doesn't describe what they're doing. The captain stamps this besides and puts a special order and whatever, and there's no more detail. Right? Those ships all sit there and don't move for 4 days. When it's anchored, they're in 42 feet of water. So when people suggest, as some have to me, well, maybe they were sitting over a Russian sub. Well, in 42 feet of water, you could have looked over the side and seen the conning tower. You could have dropped a man over the side and he could have beat out with a hammer. The other thing is when you look at the man who's in charge of the mission, who, by the way, got flown out to the command ship, Rear Admiral from Halifax, when this happens, right? Again, but it never says what the issue is, but DEFCON 1. And if you look at the definition of DEFCON 1, especially in 1960, it means nuclear war is imminent or has begun, or an equal threat. And remember, according to historians, it's never happened. So now I've got the ship's log, and it's saying it right into, this is from Library and Archives Canada.
Right.
My father's boat. Now,
Wow.
Yeah. So I'm like, no one's more stunned than me.
Right.
And it would have been so easy to miss. Like, it's quite clear and legible in the book. And by the way, you have to always look for that kind of verbiage even. Like, when the DEFCON system, it's assume it, and when you come out of it, it's reverted to,
Right.
By 3 hours later, they're back down to 5.
Right.
Now, this raises all kinds of questions. The other thing is, okay, why wouldn't it be a Russian sub? Well, like say, you could have looked over the side and seen one. The Russians didn't really have nuclear subs over here then. Remember, you got to remember how early on this is, Michelle. 1960. There hasn't been a manned mission in space yet. The Russians go 7 months later for the first time with Yuri Gagarin. It's that early, right? There's no Betty and Barney Hill. The world's forgotten about Roswell. You talk to a UFO guy, they say these things never crash. The only time people seen aliens, it was part of the contactee movement then, right? It's that early in 60 is a world apart from 67 even,
Right.
Yeah.
But DEFCON 1.
Right.
Why?
And this is for 2 alleged crafts that are underwater.
Well, according to the divers who were there. Now, let's leave the divers for a minute. Let's leave DEFCON 1.
Can I hold that thought for 1 second? We have to do a station and sponsor.
Do what you got to do.
Okay.
Yeah, otherwise we can't have a show.
You put up with a lot from me. Oh,
No, this is great. Hold that thought.
yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. You are listening to The Outer Realm with Michelle DeRoche and Amelia Pisano, coming to you live from the beautiful city of New Orleans on 105.3 and 107.7 FM radio. We are live right now on Roku, and we are in archive. And if you're watching us on Roku, thank you and welcome. Please, yes, Tamara's showing that Folgers coffee. Please share us with your friends. Our guest tonight is our dear friend, and we love him, super guest Chris Stiles. We are discussing his new book, newly launched on Amazon right now, Sweep Clear 5, NATO's UFO Encounter. I had to write that down, but great title. Beautiful book, and he's giving you a little peek into it. He's also an upcoming speaker at the Halifax Paranormal Symposium. If you're just tuning in, no worries, because you can stream our show in archive on any platform that you normally use. But don't forget to share us with your friends. And please subscribe. I say that 3 times during the station ID, just saying. Huge thank you to the amazing people at Folgers Coffee for sponsoring our show and continuing to sponsor our show. We just got that news. Thank you, Folgers. We love you. Also want to give a shout out and a thank you for our intro, and sometimes used because we can't always use it, unfortunately, with timing, is the fabulous intro and outro from Dr. Snick, the sonic surgeon, Justin Snicker, award-winning composer and musician. You can find his music on Amazon and Bandcamp, and check him out on Facebook and Instagram. He's continually dropping clips of his music on Instagram. I see that quite often with him, little bits and pieces of his amazing music and his albums. And you can reach out to him there and find out how to purchase his music. Also, if you are listening to us, watching us on Facebook, again, or on YouTube, make sure to give us a like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Tamara's watching.
And we're back.
That was a tongue tie because I got the dog under my feet. Sorry. That's why I
Dog
keep
wants
putting
in
it
on the
on
action.
mute, and he's like nibbling on my toe, and I'm just like, he's old. He's 15 in July, so he's very. He's got a lot of
Ordinary.
separation anxiety. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
All right. Now we will pick up where we left off. So, go.
Well,
Ships under the water.
yeah. So,
Legend.
well, if it isn't that, it's got to be something hot.
It's pretty significant, yes.
Because the way they responded to it is something that supposedly has never happened in history.
Right.
But, this is not an internet rumor. I think we can take the logbook of the ship as
Right.
being certain, this
Agreed.
was the case.
Yes.
Supposedly this has never happened. So they're going to have to rewrite a few history books. I kind of like that. I like stirring things up. But I've actually gotten a glimpse, not because of the log, into what was going on below deck at this time. And I'll tell you how that happened. Because, when we go back to those divers interview, at the time it was a powerful moment to see these guys like choke up trying to tell you this stuff and say, I'm sorry, I can't go anymore. You got to move on. And, wow. Okay. Well, about that same year, actually, they told me, like I say, it was around the Easter weekend, Good Friday. At the end of the summer that year, I was walking across the parking lot of the West End Mall in Halifax toward the entrance. And a fella come out who had been a work colleague of mine for 4 years at the Daily News, which was a tabloid newspaper at the time in Metro Halifax, now defunct, right? Well, I knew this guy for 4 years, seen him 7 days a week there on the job we had. And, I knew he had a career in the RCAF, the Royal Canadian Air Force. I never heard him talk about UFOs once. And when he looked at me, first thing he says is, well, God, the things you see when you don't have a gun. And I said, yeah. I said, what are you doing these days? And he said, well, the real question, I'm afraid to ask, what are you doing? I said, you wouldn't believe it if I told you. Now, at the
way
time,
they talk to each other. I don't want to ask, but
you're going to like what's coming. You're going to like it even better soon here then. So I dug out in those days, there's no computer, I don't have a cell phone yet. There's no smartphone. I used to have a binder with a bunch of the documents and paper things I had with me. And, when I was doing things in my day, like doing laundry or having a coffee in a restaurant, I'm always looking for connections or something I'd missed or somebody whose door I could knock on. I was always tracking people down. I'd gotten quite good at that, And actually was taking on paralegal work because I found I had a talent for finding things that didn't want to be found and people who didn't want to be found. Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was a good sideline. Anyway, pay the bills. So I'm doing this, and I just show him, and he just takes a glance at it real quick. He goes, what? Oh, God, he said, how did you hear about that? And I said, what? And I realized, first of all, he just looked real quick. He doesn't think that what I've shown him is about Shag Harbour, but about Shelburne. And he says, oh, God, there had to be something. They kept those ships there a week, boy, I'll tell you that. He said, I've never so goddamn glad to get off of there. And I'm like, whoa, Jim, what are you talking about?
You mean off of there?
Out of the ships. Which leads to my first question to him. I'm saying, whoa, you weren't in the Navy, you were Air Force. I thought I was, he said, but he says every time the damn Navy found something on the bottom or something crashed, it looked like it once had wings or flew or they couldn't explain. He said they'd call me. He goes, that was my gig with the Air Force, identification.
They call it AF, yeah.
Identification was my specialty. And I thought about the stories he told, but like I said, I'd never heard him talk. 4 nights, 7 nights a week, I seen this guy for about an hour. And he never talked about that. He talked a lot about his military service and other jobs he hated. So I said, yeah. And he said, oh, God, Chris, I never made a sailor. I hated the Navy. Sleeping in a hammock in those days, some guy's socks hanging in your face. It wasn't for me. I get seasick at the drop of a hat. He says, oh, I hated the ships. And they're always borrowing me, he said, borrowing me. And he said it was even worse when that Paul Hellyer came into power and we had unification, you know. And, you know, he said, everybody, you didn't know if you were a sergeant or a lieutenant or a sailor or what you were. I said, yeah, let's go back to Shelburne. I said, what about, what's this? You were there. Yeah. I said, well, what did you see? He said, now, don't get all excited on me. I didn't see nothing. He said, I was Air Force. And he said, I didn't see nothing because they didn't show me anything. And he said, that's what I remember, and that's the only time I was on a mission where that happened. Well, I said, well, how did you know when you glanced at these papers what it was about? And he said, well, every night, he said, the divers, that's all they talked about. We were down in the bar. Remember, it's the Canadian Navy. There's drinking going on, right? They're down below in the galley, right, on the Cape Scott. He didn't tell me the name. He's another one who wouldn't name the ships, or I would have solved this a long time ago. He said, yeah, we were down. He said, you know what I did for that week? He said, I read Westerns and I drank beer. And I just sat in my corner waiting for them to show me something or tell me what I was supposed to do. The only mission I was on, nothing. But he says every night the divers would be sitting there in a huddle in the corner. He said, and it was damn weird. He says they were talking some really goofy crap. And I said, well, what? He said, well, they said we were sitting over 2 UFOs underneath the ship. I said, really? Yeah, he said, and there was aliens in the water, he said, and he said, you know, he said, I didn't know what to make of it. I tried to ignore it, he said, but I realized, he said, as the days were going by, that there was this real tension on the ship, he said, and I was so glad to get off. I just sat there, and he said, borrowing books in the library, and it was damn weird. But he said, there had to be something to it. They didn't move these ships for a week. I'm like, yeah. And he said, and there was a guy, he says, I wish I could remember his name, and he's thinking hard. And he finally thinks of it. He goes, I see him at the Army-Navy Club. He says, we nod at one another. We've never talked about it. He goes, you just followed orders in those days. We never, you know, questioned it. And I said, well, what about him? Well, he was Harry that I'd already talked to. I didn't let Jim know that. And I said, yeah. Well, he said he got himself in a real mess of trouble. He got into it with the Americans, he said. The Americans came aboard our ship. He said some admiral came in, one of the Canadian admirals and Americans, and they were having what they called a hot wash-up meeting upstairs. He said, we're below deck, and this protocol officer comes down. He goes, you know, in the whites and that. He said the sailors down there were pretty good. When American sailors would come over and enlisted men, they'd treat them friendly, buy them a beer, or, you know, if they could get them to drink it, they often would refuse. But he said they were, you know, they were friendly to them, but he says they didn't like the officers going below deck. So this guy comes down in the whites, and he's sticking out like a sore thumb, and he can hear the divers talking this talk about the aliens. So he walks over to that table, leans in, and he suggests to them that they shouldn't be talking shop and to give it a rest, and maybe you shouldn't talk about that Soviet sub we're sitting over on the bottom. And instantly, the diver, Harry, the pseudonym of the book, jumps to his feet and lunges at the officer and grabs him. And I guess it's an ugly scene. And the other guys are trying to pull him off him, and the table goes over, and the drinks go everywhere. And he says, that's the trouble with you Yankee boys. He says, you think, he goes, that everything that you don't understand is the Red Menace. He goes, well, he said, I'll tell you one thing. That thing is not from Moscow or the Black Sea, whatever it is down there. He goes, it might be from Mars. I think maybe a little farther away yet. He goes, but he says, if it wanted to do us any harm, there's nothing we could do. We'd all be screwed. And he says, so I hope when you go back up there, he says, that you guys don't decide to go all John Wayne on it or something. And at this point, he lets go. The divers peel him off, said, we're sorry, sir, we're sorry. And this guy just runs out of the room and goes upstairs, and they bring the captain down, and this guy's sent to the brig. You know what I mean? But he had told me a kind of watered-down version of what happened to him, how he got in trouble. Remember the dream I had years later about him telling my father the same story. So, of course, the next question I asked Jim, I said, well, you're there. I said, what ship were you on? And he had been walking across a parking lot with a hockey bag. Yeah, in the middle of summer. It's Canada, right? And suddenly this snapped him over. He goes, "Oh, no, you don't. No, you do your own dirty work." I got to get this boy to practice. And he grabs the kit bag. And he starts walking real fast, and I follow him to his car. Once again, I couldn't get the a ship name or a date out of him, right?
Mhm.
But, I felt really good about finding somebody outside of the clique of the divers and outside of the Navy
Right.
that was actually there, that hears this. So I thought, well, maybe I can't disregard this story. And I told the other guys at the time.
I have to say, these ships. I mean, the military or the Navy was there for a week.
Yeah.
How long were these ships? Were these ships powered up? They were just resting. Were there?
Oh no, they were there. And most of the minesweepers were doing their exercises and that.
Right.
But the core ships, the two larger Canadian and U.S. vessels, never moved over where they were sitting
Until the UFOs.
They were
Did they
sitting-
leave when the UFOs left?
Yeah,
Or-
in the book, I have a chart. I show the exact position
Yeah.
where they sit. We have the coordinates. I don't think I published the actual coordinates because they're
No.
notoriously
Yeah.
inaccurate. Yeah,
Yeah.
they were in fact, the picture of me I have there by the
got it.
gate and the wire fence.
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
the gates of Canadian Forces Station
Okay,
Shelburne.
I'm gonna put it up.
Now closed in ruins, right? And if we were angled the other way and looking out to sea, you could see where this operation
on.
happened.
Hold on,
There's
hold on.
you're not going to see it in that photo, but if I leaned over the other way and the camera angle had been different, we'd have seen where this happened. Yeah,
Just
yeah.
on the other side of this.
yeah. So
Okay.
if we looked past my left shoulder and we swung the camera around,
Right.
we would have been looking out toward open sea, and there would have been a large island there with a lighthouse.
Right.
2 nautical miles past that is where this operation occurred, which is visible from the gates of the base. People call this shot enemy at the gate, by the way. I get a kick out of that.
It's
Yeah,
a great shot.
I actually entered the base, when it was still operational. It only closed in 95, right?
Wow.
And it was amazing, before the big scandal in Halifax where our American friends again, the FBI told us that we had somebody leaking secrets to the Soviets. You were allowed to go in there, things had relaxed over the years, and you could see the tracings of the SOSA system on the
Right.
wall. And I remember talking to one of the techs, and it was quite interesting. They would say, "Oh, well, that's
I'm
a
putting
plot of
this up
right
for good
whales,
measure.
100.
Sorry.
Oh, there's Dad's boat.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's so pretty.
Yeah, I just wanted to put it up because you had been talking about it. This way people
Yeah.
can see it.
Well,
I
in
forgot
fact,
I had this one. Yeah.
This is not just some old file footage.
Right.
This shot was taken on October the 15th, 1960, in Shelburne Harbor.
So pretty.
The large
Wow.
ship with 101, that was the Cape Scott. That was
Right.
Father's boat, the command vessel of the mission. There,
Right.
we had 2 other little minesweepers like you're seeing there, and we also had the Blue Throat, which was in a different position at anchor. This is
Right.
just after she's rescued. She's towed there, and they're trying to figure out what went wrong. The Yazoo brought her there, and
Right. Right.
yeah, that's
Beautiful.
from that day. I found that in the Crow's Nest magazine.
Crazy.
Yeah, it's
That's
all
just
too
crazy.
crazy. Yeah, and you can,
Wow.
if it was better copy, you could see the men looking over the side. So anyway, you know what the next source was? The human source is funny. It was secondhand, but a kind of an interesting one that you ladies might relate to, because the next people that kind of gave inside information on this, what happened would have been around 96, 97, I think. I was invited to speak at a creative writing class, and a friend of mine used to teach there. He was an academic, and I thought, geez, really? At the time, I hadn't published a book, and he said, "Oh no, I want you to go up and explain and talk about what you do and what you've done." And because I'd written a number of articles like in magazines, and he was referring on that. And anyway,
Right.
I
right.
went to do that, and when it was over, he said, "There's somebody here that hung around after class that wants to talk to you." And I can remember this tiny, small woman girl, like she would have been early 20s at the time, wanted to talk to me, and she come up to me and says, I know who told you the story about Shelburne. I said, you do? I said, what would you know about Shelburne? She said, well, I'm a Canadian Navy diver. And you see, in the 80s, there was a ship, HMCS Cormorant, and they had what Navy called an experiment, and they put a female crew on it. And these were the first divers to train to be certified as clearance divers in the Canadian Navy, and they were women.
Wow.
And some of them trained with, or they had consultants, were some of the divers that had dove on Shag Harbour and Shelburne, and guys, and some of them were just friendships that had met at the Army Navy Club or whatever. And strangely enough, there was a real kinship between these guys, because most of the guys that had dove on missions like Shelburne, except for their buddies that had been there, they had really been read the riot act. They didn't talk about this with, colleagues on the ship or younger divers they met since, right? And when they did, they often regret it when they say, we're not supposed to talk about this, but you heard I was on that mission. Don't laugh at it. And somebody in the background would start making the noise of a theremin or whatever, and they realized they were not being taken seriously enough.
Right.
The strange thing was these young women on the Cormorant experiment, and those before that were just training as divers, they understood what their old Cold War colleagues had gone through, what it was like, the training, the harsh conditions, the older equipment, and they had a respect for that. But being of that younger generation that, let's call them lost in space, they could accept the story.
Yeah.
So a kinship grew between them, and the divers talked to the women about it.
Right. Right.
And this one little girl that hung behind at the creative writing class, she told me the story, and there was a couple of little minor details, and one of the things she left me with is, you're missing one key thing. And to this day, I don't know, because I tried her a couple more times, and I went back a few years later, and unfortunately she died in her 40s of cancer.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah,
So sad.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Wow.
And I think now, knowing what I'd known and seeing, but she also wouldn't tell me the name of the ship, but she said I was missing something. So to this day, I wonder, was it the DEFCON 1? Was it the...
What was it exactly?
Whatever,
Yeah, right.
Now, something else I left out of the dream that's interesting, that I thought she was going to touch on before a girlfriend of hers drug her away that day, standing in the hallway at the university, is that she said that besides the one thing, how can I put this? There was a lot of scandal going on at the Shelburne. In fact, the Shelburne base was Canada's most secret base. It operated under a cover story, right? But that was revealed in the 80s when there was a scandal. 5 women were let go from there because they were living a lifestyle as gay women. They were lesbians. And at the time, of course, they had no rights, in the Canadian or U.S. military.
Well, it's not like
and
today.
That's right, unlike today. And the concern was for the possibility of blackmail. So they were all discharged from the military.
It's sad. Yeah, it's
right?
terrible.
And, she was friends with one of the women and put me on to meet them, but they were just as scared to talk about it. They had worked in the base. One of them I know ended up having coverage on one of the big doc shows at the time, W5 or something. The others were discharged. One of them had been questioned to the point it was verging on torture, just sleep deprivation. And
Right.
they were suspicious. The sad truth of it, as we now know now, is all that information about the true purpose of the Shelburne base and the data was already being leaked by the Walker scandal in the States.
Right.
He was taking that data and giving it to the Soviets, right? So by 1991, 4 years before the base closes its doors, the U.S. Navy acknowledged and dropped the cover story about the base. So it's a place just rife with secrets.
Yes.
Can I tell you something?
You
This
sure
is
can.
not something I normally do. From the beginning that you came, I know we have an echo. From the beginning that you came on air, I kept hearing a female voice in my head saying, "Ask Chris about W5." And I'm thinking,
Hmm.
did we talk about this last time? I'm not going to ask him about W5. What's that got to do with this? And now when you said that, I'm like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much we don't know. I mean, you can imagine the data that they were privy to, And then the Jeffrey Delisle scandal in Halifax, remember just a few years ago, you used to be able, when we were doing documentaries, I know one of the film producers I work with, Mike McDonald, he had access and went into Marlin Center, which replaced the Shelburne base, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how significant was the Shelburne base? It's not just me saying that was Canada's most secret base. It was the coordination center for submarine detection for the whole Atlantic Ocean, right? It connected with 64 SOSUS facilities around the Atlantic and Pacific. It was of major importance.
Right.
That stuff now goes to a base in the States, and the Canadian data goes to Marlin Center in Halifax. We used to be able to go in there and you could get a tour and they show it, but since the Jeffrey Delisle scandal, all that's become impossible. So there are still lots of secrets. There's lots of overlap in these things. But I think you got to look at the result. And when to me, it comes down to my father would never fess up. He passed in 2011 when I would visit him in Ontario.
Right.
He would often ask me, Harry, in the first book you did, that's so-and-so, is it? Yeah, your old Navy bud. And, Wade is so-and-so, yeah. And I'd say, you sure you never heard anything of the Shelburne story? And he said, no. No, we wouldn't go.
He took that oath to heart.
They were good guys, right? And now I find his ship was the command ship when he was serving on it, right?
Right.
He's just doing what he needed to do.
And that's a good place to end it, unfortunately. We're nearing the top of the hour. So go ahead.
Well, I just want to say, my hope is, where I get information now is at conferences like the PPRI one, although the chances are better. The week before, we're having one in Yarmouth, the Shag Harbour Incident Society.
Oh, okay.
Oh, cool.
And of course, it's all UFO, like, they got Nick Pope coming and Travis Walton, Martin Willis, right? Me.
Right.
And of course, when I'm there, I always tell people, like, you could approach me in the hallway afterward. You can tell me anything.
Right.
I'll give you a new name.
Right.
Yeah. And I spoke about it for the first time last year at our conference. It's the week before Elliot's gig there, and I'm hoping that somebody comes up and fills in that one missing thing they promised me that the girl
maybe
never
this
gave.
is what we tell everybody. Okay, this is where Chris is going to be on Saturday, October 7th. If you have any information, dig deep, people. Maybe you have family who is a part of this. In the Navy, and I think enough time has lapsed. Do you think is there some sort of time that's acceptable where people can talk about this, or is it like a forever don't talk about it?
Well,
I mean, we're in disclosure now.
It's like rock and roll. You can't do anything about it. It
Sounds
happened.
like a code.
It happened. Yeah. That's what Jerry Garcia said. The FBI can't make it go away, right?
Yeah, but we're talking disclosure now. Now there's a whole different outlook on things now.
But does disclosure cover the security clearances, though? Because the Americans are different than the Canadians when it comes to that. We know that. It's not in a bad thing, so please don't email me. We're saying that disclosure is just more open here.
Right.
And there was a lot of American ships there, so you're not going to get as many people talking.
No, there was a greater emphasis on security south of the border. Yeah. And you know something? Anybody that wants to know how much I respect that, read the dedication at the front of the book to those people that served in that difficult period I call the Cold War. And it says quite clearly right there, I respect those that have told me their story that were brave. I respect those that honored their duty to the grave, to the end.
Beautiful.
It's too easy to judge them looking back from our perspective, right?
Right.
You
When
shouldn't.
these guys were asked to sometimes face the unknown while never being allowed to acknowledge his existence.
Yeah. They
Right.
were put under more pressure, not more pressure in battle, but more pressure in these kind of things than anybody would be today.
Yeah. The end of the book, it tells you how to get your hot tips to me so I can
Cool.
go at it
Oh,
directly.
there we go.
Yay.
There you go.
So you got to
Okay.
get the book.
Well, there's a shameless plug, but either that,
No, it's not shameless. That's
No.
why we want you here.
that's
We
how
want
it
you to
works.
plug in.
That's how I get at it because, I don't give up. It's like Stanton said, I'm a bulldog. I grab on and
Okay, I'm gonna put
I'm so glad that you do. And I think that this
There we
story,
go.
I truly believe,
There we
is
go.
yours.
Okay, there we go.
It's yours
Get
to
this up
tell,
again.
Chris.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I'm thrilled that you joined us tonight, and it's always fascinating to listen to your stories. We learn so much,
Yeah.
and for us, again, we just sit there, we absorb it, we listen, and I'm
Take
sure
note.
our listeners the same. But I think
Well-
it'd be great to hear this in person, and I hope a lot of people make their
Well-
way out to see you. And
I hope that some of our U.S. friends, I'd like to see them. We had quite a few last year. I'd like
Yeah.
to see them come up here. I'd like to see them go to see the PPRI here in our capital in Halifax.
yeah,
But, you come down to Yarmouth where Betty Hill used to visit us all the time
right.
down there. And they can come down and see our conference the week before. Take the whole schmo in.
Oh,
I
I need
love
to
it.
come down there because I said on my bucket list that I would go to Pier 21 to walk the steps that my parents and my brother did.
There we
So
go.
That's a
Right.
great place. I love it
Yeah.
there. You can feel the history there, I'll tell you.
I have photographs and things from there I've purchased from
Mm-hmm.
there. You can get your family's name written on the ship that they came in on,
Yes.
the time, the date, everything. And I'd like to go there in person.
hmm
So, yeah.
Well, we're there. I always say
know.
ending a show because there's just always so much more to
Yeah.
talk about. But I'll tell you, if you delve further and you have more that you'd like to talk about, you are always welcome to come back. You have an open door policy, so just reach out. Say, I've got this going on. Like, okay, we're in.
Yep.
So we
You
want
make me
in.
sound like Columbo. I got this little problem,
Thank-
right?
I know. I love it.
Actually, I have a whole pile of problems, right?
I like Telly Savalas more because he always had a lollipop.
Had a lolly. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Kojak, wasn't
Mm-hmm.
it? Had the-
Yeah, Coach. That's
I used
right.
to watch him. I was very young when that came out. Named our German Shepherd Columbo. That was my dad.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank
Chris.
you for the invitation.
Oh, my
and,
God.
Thank you so much.
It
Thank you
is a
for sharing
pleasure.
so much.
Hopefully,
And-
when I come back, I'll have more answers still. That's my mission.
I would love that. I really hope that somebody reaches out and fills in those blanks for you. Fascinating story to say
Well-
the least. So thank you for sharing it with us, and I hope somebody shows up at the symposium or your other event and says, "Hey, I have more information. Here's
Yeah.
the missing link that you've been looking for."
That's how it all starts. A hot tip,
Fingers crossed.
Yes.
Hot blood.
Tip. That's
hot
right.
blood, a sleepless night, and away I go.
There we go.
Yeah,
There
we
we go.
You're the best, Chris. You are the best. It's such an honor. Thank you.
Well,
Thank you so much.
thank you for the invitation. Yeah, we'll do it
Thank
again
you.
sometime. Sure.
Oh, absolutely. I hope we
Enjoy
do.
the beach.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, I'll warn you about that beach weather here is an exaggeration.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm still jealous you have a beach that has salt water on it.
Oh, I have all kinds.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have
Very
some
jealous.
with UFOs too. You'll have to read that sometime.
Or you could just
2018.
come back and
That's in
tell
the
us all
book.
about it.
I'd be glad to. Yeah.
Okay.
Hey.
All right.
I'll even send you some video of that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll
Yeah.
play it during the show.
Sure.
So I will contact you. We will look at a date. Sometime maybe again, but just before the symposium. So it's just more promo for you.
Yeah.
And we'll bring you on and we'll look at some
Yeah.
video and we'll talk about
Yeah.
some stuff. Oh, I like it.
August,
Okay.
September would be great. Yeah, I'll give you some good stuff. All right.
Okay.
Hey.
I'm in.
Bye bye, ladies. No,
Up
it was
for
a
video.
pleasure. Good. Love it.
Good night.
Thank
night.
you. Good night.
Yeah.
It's late for him.
It
It's
is.
midnight. Yeah.
Well, that was really cool. I really excited that he would come back on and give us some video. Video is fun, right, you guys?
Yeah.
Anyway, but we are at the end of another, awesome segment of the show. As always, it's hard to say goodbye to our guests. But thank you, everybody, for tuning in, everybody in chat. I know there's a lot to digest tonight. It was a lot of fascinating information. So sometimes it's easier just to sit and listen. But big thank you to everybody in chat. Big thank you to Chris Stiles. Big thank you to Folgers Coffee for sponsoring the show. Another big thank you to Justin Snicker, aka Dr. Snick, Steve McGinnis. Thank you. Next week, Wednesday, we're going to continue on with Symposium guests. And of course, we're welcoming back Elliot Van Dusen, who is pretty much the guy putting this shindig on. And of course, the Outer Realm is, the big sponsor of the symposium. And we're really happy to be here doing this and advertising them and being a part of it all. It's all very exciting. But next week, he's coming back on Wednesday night with his colleague and another guest speaker, Daryl Walsh. And what's going to be fun about this is Daryl is like pretty skeptical about a lot of things. So we're going to be talking about the paranormal hardcore.
Mm-hmm.
We'll cover things like orbs and EVPs and the whole Xbox Connect technology. For those who don't know what it is, you see that on TV. It's a little stick figure guys that you see. It's interesting for sure. So I'm looking forward to seeing what he has. But you're definitely going to have to get in chat if you guys want in on this, because there's going to be, I'm sure, a lot, being covered. So please don't miss that. Thursday night, we welcome the return of our dear friend Bill Bean.
Oh, yes.
I know, and he's got some interesting things in mind as well. We were left on the last show with all kinds of things he wanted to talk about. So we're going to see what he wants to touch on, and we're going to totally get into it and go from there. So it's going to be another really exciting week. So
Sunday.
Yeah, right. And in America, guys, you guys have a 3-day weekend.
No,
right?
we have a show Sunday.
We have a show Sunday night. Yeah, so
Yes.
check out Nocturnal Frequency, 9:00 Eastern time. Bubbles and I are going to be on with our compadres. So it's just
No burritos.
I know.
No burritos.
Yeah, so they stop by often in the chat, so please come and support us. So that's Nocturnal Frequency. Find them on YouTube, and you can just set a little reminder, and we're all going to get in there. Steve Genier and Alex Rondini, both great couple of guys, and Alex seems to think Amelia and I are his spirit animals, so we're going to see how that goes. We're going to see how that goes. But with the long weekend, this weekend coming up in the U.S., guys, please, be safe and have a good time, but expect you guys all to make it here next week. All right. So night all. Have a good weekend.